What if the love of your life was 44, had an irritating British accent and hated your guts? The pain of divorce and stagnation won't stop you from starting over. This couple proves that hate is just the excuse you give for undeniable attraction. Prepare yourself for a story of pure, mature, romantic comedy. Curious? Before we begin, subscribe, hit the like button, turn on notifications, and use the hype feature to help us grow. Freddie Brown was not the type to believe in second chances. At 44, he had concluded that life was a predictable sequence of disappointments punctuated by lukewarm tea and literary critiques that no one actually read. London had been his home for decades, a gray city that perfectly matched his mood and his stagnant career as a literary critic for a newspaper that, frankly, was also slowly dying. He used to say that his only true passion was books. Women? Well, he had tried. His marriage to Margaret lasted long enough for him to realize that sharing a life with someone required more than just British sarcasm and obscure references to Dickens. She left him for a dentist. A dentist. Freddie still found that offensive. Now, sitting on a plane bound for Mendoza, Argentina, with a neck brace that the doctor insisted was necessary after a ridiculous fall down his stairs at home, Freddie wondered how the hell he had ended up there. The answer lay in a lawyer's letter informing him that his Uncle Jeffrey, an eccentric man he had seen maybe 3 times in his life, had died and left him a vineyard. A vineyard? I can barely take care of a fern, he muttered to himself, adjusting the neck brace and ignoring the curious gaze of the flight attendant. Wine, of course, because his life needed more irony. The truth was, Freddie had nothing left holding him in London. The newspaper was laying people off, his apartment was too expensive, and the idea of spending the next 20 years alone, complaining about best-selling novels on a blog no one read, seemed worse than trying to manage a vineyard on the other side of the world. So there he was, flying into the unknown with a suitcase full of sweaters, utterly unsuitable for the Argentine climate, and zero expectation that this would work out. Across the Atlantic, Summer Armstrong was having a day that would make any therapist rub their hands with satisfaction. She had just left a disastrous meeting with a client in Napa Valley, a pretentious producer who thought he understood wine because he watched a Netflix documentary. Summer, a wine consultant respected and feared in equal measure, had no patience. She told him exactly what she thought about his overpriced Chardonnay, grabbed her Prada bag, the only extravagance she allowed herself, and slammed the door on the way out. At 44, Summer had built a solid reputation in the wine industry. She was good. No, she was excellent. She could spot a mediocre wine from a mile away and transform forgotten vineyards into profitable brands. But being good at what she did didn't make her particularly well-liked. She was direct, impatient, and allergic to flimsy excuses. Her divorce from Robert 5 years ago had solidified her life philosophy. Second chances are overrated. He traded her for a yoga instructor 20 years her junior, and Summer decided she would never again waste time on men who couldn't keep up with her pace. Since then, her life was work, work, and more work. And she liked it that way. Well, most of the time. Sitting at the airport, waiting for her flight to Buenos Aires and then Mendoza, Summer was furiously typing on her phone, answering emails while drinking a double espresso. Her daughter, 22-year-old Savannah, had just sent a sequence of messages that mixed ridiculous memes with unsolicited advice about her love life. The girl insisted her mother needed to relax, that Mendoza was romantic, and who knows, maybe she would meet an attractive man there. Summer rolled her eyes and replied that she was going to work, not sightsee, and that an attractive man was not a professional category. Savannah countered that her mother was complicated and should at least try to have fun, like drinking wine without analyzing the tannins. Summer typed a dry no, and her daughter finished with an "I love you, but you are unbearable." Summer smiled. Savannah was everything she was not. Light-hearted, spontaneous, too optimistic for her own good. Sometimes Summer wondered how she had raised a daughter so different from herself, but there was no time for existential reflections. She had a job to do. A decaying vineyard in Mendoza needed saving, and Summer Armstrong was the right woman for it. The owner was a newly arrived Englishman, an inexperienced heir, probably lost and desperate. Perfect. She loved a challenge. What? Summer didn't know, as she boarded the plane with her briefcase and unwavering determination, was that Freddie Brown was not exactly the type of man who accepted being saved, much less by a bossy American with an opinion about everything. Freddie arrived in Mendoza on a hot, sunny afternoon, the absolute opposite of London. He immediately hated it. The heat, the excessive light, the fact that everyone seemed too happy. Who needed that much sun? The property was a few miles from the city, a dirt road that made the taxi shake in a way that didn't help his neck brace at all. When he finally arrived, Freddie got out of the car and looked around with an expression that oscillated between incredulity and desperation. The vineyard was, well, a disaster. The vines looked neglected, the main house needed a serious overhaul, and there was a shed that was clearly about to collapse. But there was something there, something quiet, silent, almost peaceful. Freddie sighed and asked himself what the hell he had done with his life. That's when he saw Brian for the first time. A robust man around 50, gray hair and a practical expression that screamed, "I've seen it all." He was standing next to an old Jeep, arms crossed, watching Freddie with curiosity. He introduced himself as Brian Mitchell, Jeffrey's partner. Well, he was a partner. Now, apparently, he was Freddie's partner. He extended his hand, and Freddie shook it, trying to look less lost than he felt. He immediately stated that he knew nothing about wine, to which Brian let out a short laugh and said that was great, because the consultant he had hired knew everything. She would arrive the day after tomorrow. Freddie frowned and asked who this consultant was. Brian explained that her name was Summer Armstrong, American, a vineyard specialist. Jeffrey had hired her before he died, but she had only managed to come now. He gave Freddie a pat on the shoulder and told him to relax, that she would sort everything out. Freddie did not like the tone of "she will sort everything out." He didn't need to be sorted out. Neither did his vineyard. Well, perhaps the vineyard did, but he was definitely not going to let a bossy American dictate the rules of what to do. Meanwhile, Summer was landing in Buenos Aires, already mentally planning her strategy. 2 days in Mendoza, assess the vineyard, talk to the inexperienced owner, draw up a plan. Simple, efficient. She had no idea that Freddie Brown was, at that very moment, deciding he didn't like her, and she hadn't even arrived yet. Summer arrived at the vineyard on a bright morning, the kind of morning that made Mendoza look like it was straight out of a postcard. The taxi dropped her off at the property entrance, and she stepped out with her black-wheeled suitcase, oversized sunglasses, and a demeanor that clearly stated, "I'm here to work, not to impress anyone." Still, it was impossible not to notice that she was beautiful, not in the obvious way, but in that natural, elegant manner that comes with confidence and good taste. Blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail, a white linen shirt, impeccable beige trousers, and flats that, though practical, looked expensive. Summer Armstrong didn't need to try. She simply was. Brian greeted her with a warm smile and a firm handshake. He liked her immediately. There was something about that woman that conveyed competence and seriousness, but also a kind of hidden warmth, as if behind that professional armor there was someone who genuinely laughed when no one was looking. He guided her through the property, showing her the vines, the fermentation shed that urgently needed repairs, and talking about the place's history. Summer asked precise questions, mentally noted every detail, and was already beginning to assemble an action plan. This was exactly the kind of challenge she loved, taking something broken and turning it into something that worked. Then Brian mentioned Freddie, the new owner, the heir, the Englishman who knew absolutely nothing about wine, and who, in Brian's words, had an impressive ability to turn any conversation into an exercise in British sarcasm. Summer smiled. She had dealt with difficult owners before. A grumpy Englishman wouldn't be a problem. Freddie, at that moment, was on the main house's veranda, sitting on a wooden chair that creaked with every movement, reading a book and drinking tea. Yes, tea. In Mendoza, in the middle of the morning. He was still wearing the cursed neck brace, not because he needed it, but because he had forgotten to take it off, or perhaps because he liked the idea of looking slightly ridiculous yet simultaneously untouchable. When he heard voices approaching, he lifted his eyes from his book and saw Brian walking next to an elegant blonde woman who, somehow, seemed to be assessing every inch of the property as if she already owned the place. Ah, the consultant. Freddie slowly closed his book, adjusted his neck brace, and waited. Summer climbed the veranda steps with the confidence of someone accustomed to walking in anywhere and taking charge. She removed her sunglasses, revealing intelligent, direct blue eyes, and extended her hand. She said she was Summer Armstrong, wine consultant, and that she was there to help him turn this place into something profitable. Her voice was firm. No nonsense, as if she were ready to start working immediately. Freddie shook her hand, noting the firm, almost defiant grip, and replied with a slight nod. He introduced himself as Freddie Brown, the reluctant heir, and added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes that he hadn't asked for help, but that Brian seemed to have decided for him. Summer raised an eyebrow. Ah, so he was that type. The kind who pretended not to need anyone while everything around them was collapsing. She was familiar with the profile. She replied with a slightly venomous sweetness that she perfectly understood, but perhaps he should consider that vineyards do not save themselves, especially when the owner doesn't know the difference between a Malbec grape and a raisin. There was a silence. Brian cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Freddie, however, tilted his head and smiled. A slow, dangerous smile, the kind that came with a sharp retort. He said that, indeed, he didn't know the difference, but that he was reasonably certain Summer also didn't know the difference between a client and an enemy, considering she had just insulted the property owner within the first 30 seconds of conversation. Summer blinked, then smiled back, an equally dangerous smile. So, this grumpy Englishman had a sense of humor. Interesting. She crossed her arms and said she had no intention of insulting, merely of establishing facts. And the fact was that the vineyard was in a deplorable state and needed someone who knew what they were doing. If he was too proud to accept help, she had better things to do. Freddie slowly stood up, leaving the book on the chair. He was tall, more so than Summer expected, and there was something about him that was irritatingly attractive in a completely inappropriate way for the situation. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, as if reading between the lines of every word. Or perhaps it was just the British accent. Darn, British accent, he said with a studied calm, that he wasn't too proud to accept help, but he also wasn't stupid enough to hand over control of something that was now his to a stranger who had just arrived and was already distributing orders as if she owned the place. Brian intervened before the situation escalated. He said they were all on the same side, that the goal was to save the vineyard, and that maybe it would be a good idea to start over, with less hostility and more coffee. Or wine. Wine always helped. Summer and Freddie stared at each other for another moment, neither willing to yield first. Then Summer sighed, uncrossed her arms and said that coffee would be great. Freddie nodded, still without breaking eye contact, and muttered that he would also accept coffee, provided it didn't come with any more unsolicited advice. Summer smiled. Oh, he was going to hear a lot of advice, solicited or not. The coffee was served in the main house's kitchen, a spacious, rustic area that smelled of old wood and something vaguely floral that Freddie couldn't quite place. Summer sat down at the solid wooden table, pulling a folder from her bag and spreading papers as if she were about to give a lecture. Freddie leaned back in his chair, holding his coffee cup and observing her with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. Brian, wise as ever, invented an excuse about needing to check something in the shed and disappeared, leaving the two of them alone. Summer began to explain, clearly and objectively, the current state of the vineyard. Production was low, the vines needed care, the fermentation equipment was ancient, and the brand, well, it didn't exist. If they wanted any chance of competing in the market, they needed a strategy, and fast. She spoke with authority, gesturing occasionally, and Freddie had to admit, even if reluctantly, that she knew what she was talking about. But there was something about the way she took control that deeply irritated him. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. And Freddie hated it when other people were right, especially when he was lost. He interrupted her mid-sentence about tannins and asked, with a dangerous tranquility, if she always treated her clients like incompetent students or if he was receiving special treatment. Summer stopped, put down her pen, and looked directly at him. She replied that she treated all her clients with the same honesty, and that if he preferred empty compliments and false hopes, perhaps he should hire someone else. But if he wanted to save this place, he needed to hear the truth. And the truth was, he didn't know what he was doing. Freddie leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He said he was fully aware that he didn't know what he was doing, but that didn't mean he needed to be treated like an imbecile. He had a brain, life experience, and, believe it or not, had managed difficult situations before. Maybe not with grapes, but with words, ideas, and people infinitely more complicated than vines. Summer raised an eyebrow. "Ah, so he was a writer?" Freddie corrected her. "Literary critic. Or ex-critic, technically." Summer smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Ah, so he spent his life judging the work of others without ever creating anything of his own. How convenient." There was a cold silence. Freddie felt his blood boil. That woman had not just said that, but she had. And the worst part was that she didn't even blink. She simply continued looking at him with that expression of someone who had just scored a point and knew it. Freddie took a deep breath. He replied, with forced calm, that at least he had enough talent to recognize mediocrity when he saw it, and that, at that moment, he was looking at someone who clearly compensated for a lack of empathy with an excess of arrogance. Summer tilted her head, her eyes shining with something between amusement and challenge. She said that arrogance was an interesting word coming from someone who wore a neck brace as a fashion accessory and who apparently thought British sarcasm was a substitute for real competence. Brian chose that moment to return, walking through the kitchen door with an expression of someone who already knew he had made a mistake by leaving them alone. He asked, cautiously, if everything was all right. Freddie and Summer answered at the same time, in excessively polite voices, that yes, everything was great. Brian didn't believe it for a second. The rest of the meeting was tense, but productive. Summer presented the plan. Freddie asked specific and, surprisingly, intelligent questions, and the two managed to maintain an almost civilized conversation. Almost. There was an electrical current in the air, something neither of them could ignore. It wasn't exactly attraction, at least not yet, but it was something, a kind of mutual recognition that they had found their match. Someone who wouldn't bow down, someone who fought back. When Summer finally stood up to leave, she said she would return the next morning to start the detailed assessment of the vines. Freddie nodded, still seated, and murmured that she would be welcome, provided she left the professorial tone at home. Summer smiled, picked up her bag, and before walking out, turned to him and said, with a poisonous sweetness, that if he took off the neck brace, maybe he could see better what was right in front of him. Freddie watched her leave, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading across the veranda. Only then did he realize he was smiling. A small, annoyed but genuine smile. That woman was unbearable. And, for some incomprehensible reason, he could hardly wait to see her again. Summer had a clear plan for that week. Turn the vineyard into something functional. Train its incompetent owner just enough so he wouldn't ruin everything after she left, and maintain a safe professional distance from Freddie Brown. The problem was that Freddie, apparently, had decided to make her life as complicated as humanly possible. The morning after their disastrous first meeting, Summer arrived at the vineyard at 7 o'clock sharp, ready to begin the technical evaluation of the vines. She found Freddie in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, a navy cotton set completely inappropriate for any human being awake past 6 a.m. Buri's making tea with the solemnity of a man performing a sacred ritual. He greeted her with a slow nod, eyes half closed, and asked in that rough, sleep-thickened voice whether she always showed up this early or was just trying to prove something. Summer, already on her 4th cup of coffee and having answered 17 emails, said she arrived early because there was work to be done, something he clearly wasn't familiar with. Freddie took a sip of tea, adjusted the neck brace. Yes, he was still wearing it, and replied that his idea of work involved thinking, not running around pretending to be productive. That was how the week began. Over the next few days, Summer discovered that working with Freddie was like trying to teach quantum physics to someone who insisted on questioning the existence of gravity. He wasn't stupid, far from it. In fact, he was annoyingly intelligent, but he had an impressive ability to turn any simple instruction into a philosophical debate about the nature of authority. When she explained that the vines needed proper pruning to maximize production, Freddie asked if she didn't think she was being a bit dictatorial with the plants. Summer replied, with a patience she didn't know she possessed, that plants didn't have feelings. Freddie countered that perhaps plants didn't, but he certainly did. and being bossed around all the time was starting to affect his. When she suggested investing in new oak barrels to improve wine quality, Freddie wondered aloud if the old ones didn't have a certain vintage charm that could be used for marketing. Summer explained, speaking slowly as if to a stubborn child, that vintage charm didn't make up for inferior wine. Freddie said he disagreed, that the world was full of mediocre things being sold successfully thanks to good marketing, and maybe she should consider that before spending his money, yes, his, on expensive barrels. Summer took a deep breath, counted to 10, then to 20, and finally said in a dangerously calm voice that if he wanted to keep producing mediocre wine and go bankrupt, she'd be happy to go home and let him sink alone. Freddie crossed his arms and said no one was stopping her from leaving. Brian, who witnessed these daily debates with the weary look of a tired father, started to seriously question whether hiring Summer had been a good idea. But every time he thought about stepping in, the two somehow reached an agreement. Usually after another 15 minutes of heated arguing, but still. On the third day, the first truly embarrassing incident happened. Summer was in the fermentation shed, checking equipment and making notes on everything that needed replacing or repair. Freddie had decided for the first time since arriving in Mendoza that he should try to be useful. He walked into the shed wearing borrowed boots 2 sizes too big, tripped over a loose cable on the floor and, in his attempt to regain balance, grabbed the first thing within reach. Unfortunately, that thing was Summer, more specifically her shoulder, pulling her back hard enough to make her stumble, drop her clipboard, and, in a move worthy of a slapstick comedy film, crash into a shelf full of empty bottles. The bottles fell, all of them, one after another, in a spectacular echoing domino effect. When silence finally returned, Freddie was practically hugging Summer, trying not to fall, and she stood, frozen, wide-eyed, staring at the disaster of shattered glass across the floor. Freddie released her immediately, as if he'd just touched something hot, stepped back, hit his shoulder on a wooden beam, and let out an impressive British curse. Summer slowly turned to him, her face pure disbelief. She asked in terrifying calm if he had just destroyed 3 dozen bottles because he didn't know how to tie his shoes properly. Freddie, still rubbing his back, replied that the boots weren't his. The cable was in the way, and technically it was the fault of whoever had placed the bottles on such an unstable shelf. Summer said the shelf had been perfectly stable until a clumsy Englishman decided to walk in like it was a minefield. Freddie opened his mouth to respond, stepped on a piece of glass that made an awful crunching sound, and decided silence was the wiser choice. Brian came running, took one look at the scene, and simply sighed. He said he'd fetch a broom, and maybe a shot of whiskey, for himself, not for them. On the 5th day, Summer made her own mistake. She was testing the irrigation system, trying to understand why some rows of vines were getting less water than others. Freddie, who had decided that if Summer could work alone, so could he, was on the other side of the vineyard doing exactly the same thing. Neither of them knew the other was tinkering with the system. So when Summer opened a valve to test the water flow, Freddie happened to be standing right in front of a sprinkler that chose that very moment to function perfectly. The jet of water hit Freddie squarely, soaking him from head to toe in less than 3 seconds. He screamed, a high-pitched, very un-British scream, and Summer, hearing the commotion, ran over to see what had happened. She found Freddie dripping wet, removing his drenched neck brace and looking at her with the purest expression of betrayal. Summer clapped a hand over her mouth, trying and failing to hide the laughter threatening to burst out. Freddie pointed a wet finger at her and declared, in a trembling voice of indignation, that this was unacceptable, that she'd done it on purpose, and that he demanded an immediate apology. Summer tried to explain, saying she hadn't known he was there, that it was an accident, but her words came out between fits of laughter, real laughter for the first time since arriving in Mendoza. Freddie, wet and miserable, looked at her laughing and said with deadly seriousness that she was the cruelest person he had ever met. Then the wind blew. Freddie sneezed, a pathetic, soggy sneeze, and Summer laughed even harder. Freddie turned around and walked back toward the house, leaving a trail of water behind him and muttering something about sadistic American women and cursed vineyards. Summer stayed there, still laughing, and thought that maybe, just maybe, this job was going to be a lot more fun than she'd expected. By the end of the week, Brian gathered the two of them in the kitchen for a serious talk. He was exhausted. They were making progress, yes, but the constant tension was starting to affect everyone's morale, including Dylan, the young enologist who had recently joined the vineyard and clearly had no idea how to handle such an explosive dynamic. Brian said, with a firmness that left no room for argument, that they needed to find a way to work together. For real. No more daily wars. No more accidental sabotage, and no more turning every decision into an Oxford-style debate. Summer crossed her arms and said she was doing her job perfectly well. Thank you very much. Freddie muttered that he would be doing his job too if someone would stop treating him like an incompetent intern. Brian slammed his hand on the table. He said he didn't care who was right or wrong, that the only thing that mattered was saving the vineyard, and if they couldn't set their pride aside for 5 minutes, everyone would lose, including him. An awkward silence followed. Then Summer sighed. Without looking at Freddie, she said that maybe she could try to be a little less direct. Freddie, staring at the floor, murmured that maybe he could try to be a little less difficult. Brian nodded, visibly relieved. He said it was a start. And it was. Just a start. Because neither of them had the slightest intention of making things easy for the other. But at least, for the first time, they were trying. The second week in Mendoza began with Freddie sitting alone on the veranda at 6 in the morning, holding a cup of tea and watching the sun rise over the mountains. He had stopped wearing the neck brace 3 days earlier, not because he no longer needed it, but because Summer had made a sarcastic comment about him looking like a lost tourist, and Freddie, stubborn as ever, decided he would rather endure pain than give her the satisfaction of being right. The truth was, Mendoza was beginning to grow on him. Not in the romantic way people described when talking about life changes and fresh starts. It was subtler than that. It was the way the silence of morning wrapped around him like an old, familiar blanket. The way the air smelled different there, clean with a hint of earth and something floral he still couldn't identify. Even the heat, which he had hated on the first day, was starting to feel less aggressive and more honest. As if Mendoza had no patience for pretenses. Freddie took another sip of tea and thought about London, about his small, overpriced apartment, the gray afternoons spent in cafes, the editorial meetings where everyone pretended to care about literature while really only caring about sales. He thought about Margaret, who was probably waking up next to the dentist right about now, planning a predictable, safe life that Freddie had never been able to give her. And he realized with a surprise so sharp it was almost funny that he didn't miss any of it. What unsettled him wasn't the absence of longing. It was realizing that maybe he had never truly belonged there at all, that perhaps he had spent 44 years living a life that looked right on paper but never quite fit in reality. And now here he was. On a vineyard he had no idea how to manage, in a country where he barely spoke the language, surrounded by grapes, dust, and an infuriating American woman who managed to irritate him more in 5 minutes than Margaret had in 10 years of marriage. The door behind him opened. Brian stepped out, holding a cup of coffee, and sat in the chair beside him without asking permission. They sat in silence for several minutes, just watching the sun climb higher, and Freddie appreciated that Brian was the kind of man who understood the value of not speaking when there was nothing worth saying. But then Brian spoke anyway. He said Freddie was doing better than he'd expected, that he'd seen plenty of people inherit property and give up after the first week. But Freddie was hanging in there, even learning a few things. Freddie let out a short, bitter laugh and said learning was a generous word. He was mostly stumbling in the dark and hoping not to break anything valuable. Brian shrugged and replied, "That's how everyone learned anything worth knowing. Stumbling, breaking things, and fixing them later." Freddie glanced at him, curious. He asked how Brian had ended up there working at the vineyard with Uncle Jeffrey. Brian took a long sip of coffee before answering. He said he'd met Jeffrey 30 years ago, when both were young and foolish and believed they could conquer the world. Jeffrey had wanted to make wine, and Brian had wanted to escape a life that made no sense in Australia. So they'd teamed up, bought the property, and spent 3 decades trying to make it work. It hadn't always worked, he added with a wistful smile, but it had always been worth it. Freddie asked if Brian regretted anything. Brian thought for a long moment. He said he regretted not saying certain things while Jeffrey was still alive. Important things things that had seemed too obvious to say, until suddenly there was no time left to say them. Another silence fell. Freddie felt something tighten in his chest. He asked, almost involuntarily, if Brian thought he was wasting his time there, if he was being selfish by trying to hold on to something he clearly didn't know how to manage. Brian looked at him seriously. He said the only selfish thing would be to give up without trying, that Jeffrey had left this place to Freddie for a reason, even if that reason wasn't clear yet, and that sometimes life wasn't about knowing what to do. It was about having the courage to stay and find out. Freddie didn't answer. He just nodded, eyes on the horizon, and for the first time since arriving in Mendoza, he felt something that could almost be mistaken for hope. Meanwhile, Summer was sitting at the small inn where she'd rented a room, answering emails with an efficiency that bordered on obsessive. Eden, the owner of the inn, a woman in her 60s with long gray hair and a perpetual smile that irritated Summer deeply, had the inconvenient habit of appearing out of nowhere with unsolicited tea and even less solicited life advice. That morning, Eden stepped into the small makeshift office Summer had set up in the living room, placed a cup of herbal tea beside the laptop, and said in that calm, philosophical voice she used for everything that Summer worked too much. Summer, without looking up from the screen, replied that working too much was better than not working enough. Eden sat in the armchair opposite her, crossed her legs and said there was a difference between working because you love what you do and working to avoid thinking about other things. Summer finally looked at her, wearing an expression that clearly said, "Please go away." But Eden didn't. She simply kept watching Summer with those gentle, infuriatingly perceptive eyes. Summer sighed, closed the laptop, and asked, through gritted teeth, what exactly Eden thought she was avoiding. Eden smiled. She said she didn't know, but that she'd seen many people pass through Mendoza over the years, and she could always tell which ones were running from something. And Summer was definitely running. Maybe, not physically, but emotionally. Summer rolled her eyes and said Eden should consider swapping the inn for a fortune-telling tent in the town square. Eden laughed, stood up and said, before leaving, that Mendoza had a funny way of making people face exactly what they were trying to avoid, and that Summer should be ready. Summer was left alone, staring at the tea she hadn't asked for. She picked up the cup, took a sip, and admitted, only to herself, that Eden wasn't entirely wrong. Because the truth was, Summer was tired. Not physically, though working with Freddie Brown was exhausting in ways she hadn't thought possible, but emotionally. Tired of always being in control. Tired of being the one who fixed everyone else's problems. Tired of not having anyone to fix hers. Savannah had called the night before, chattering about a new job, a new boyfriend, and a new life philosophy involving some kind of transcendental meditation and green smoothies. Summer had listened, asked the right questions at the right times, and hung up the phone feeling strangely hollow. Not because she didn't love her daughter, she did desperately, but because she realized more and more that Savannah had a full, vibrant life. And Summer, well, Summer had work, and an ex-husband who was remarried, and friends she only saw at wine conferences, and a routine that looked perfect on paper but lately felt insufficient. Mendoza was supposed to be just another job, another vineyard to save, another difficult client to manage, but there was something about that place that unsettled her. Maybe it was the way time seemed to move slower there, or how people actually looked her in the eyes when they spoke, as if they genuinely cared. Or maybe it was Freddie Brown, with his sarcastic remarks and infuriating stubbornness, who managed to get under her skin in ways no one else could. Not that she liked him. Definitely not. He was irritating, presumptuous, and had a remarkable talent for turning any simple task into unnecessary drama. But there was something about him, something she couldn't entirely ignore. Maybe it was the intelligence buried beneath all that sarcasm, or the vulnerability he tried so hard to mask with arrogance. Or maybe it was simply that he was the first person in years who didn't try to please her. Summer shook her head, annoyed at herself for even thinking that. She wasn't there to psychoanalyze the vineyard's owner. She was there to do her job and leave. Simple as that. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Savannah, asking how the new job was going. Savannah replied within seconds with 3 heart emojis and a meme about Monday mornings. Summer smiled, put the phone away, and went back to work. Because work Work was something she understood. Work made sense. Everything else, well, everything else could wait. That afternoon, Summer was in the vineyard reviewing her irrigation notes when Dylan appeared, carrying a toolbox and wearing a slightly lost expression. Dylan was about 28, Argentine, with dreamy eyes and a genuine passion for wine that bordered on poetic. He was the kind of person who spoke about tannins as if he were describing a symphony, and Summer had to admit, albeit reluctantly, that he knew what he was talking about. Dylan asked with his usual politeness if Summer needed any help. She said no, but thanked him anyway. Dylan hesitated, then asked with genuine curiosity if she and Freddie always argued that way. Summer stopped writing and looked at him, one eyebrow raised. She asked what exactly he meant by that way. Dylan blushed slightly, realizing he might have stepped onto dangerous ground, but went on. He said that he and Brian had noticed that Summer and Freddie argued a lot, but it didn't seem like the kind of arguing that came from disrespect. It seemed more like, he hesitated, searching for the right words, like two people who challenged each other because they knew the other could keep up, like they were testing limits, not out of malice, but curiosity. Summer stayed silent for a moment. Then she said, with the kind of firmness that allowed no debate, that there was nothing special about her arguments with Freddie. They were simply normal professional disagreements between two people with different visions. Dylan nodded, clearly unconvinced, but smart enough not to push it. He smiled, said he'd go help Brian in the shed and left, leaving Summer alone with her thoughts. And her thoughts, unfortunately, were starting to bother her, because maybe Dylan was right. Maybe the arguments with Freddie were different. Not because they meant anything romantic, absolutely not, but because Freddie challenged her, questioned her decisions, refused to accept things just because she said so, and as frustrating as that was, there was something refreshing about it, as if, for the first time, she'd found someone who wasn't afraid to disagree with her. Summer shook her head, irritated. She didn't need someone to disagree with her. She needed someone who would do what she said so the work could get done. But as she turned back to her notes, a small voice in her head whispered that maybe needing and wanting were two very different things. Meanwhile, Freddie was in the shed with Brian and Dylan, trying to understand how the fermentation process worked. Dylan explained it with almost religious enthusiasm, gesturing dramatically and using metaphors that involved music, poetry, and, at one particularly confusing point, dance. Freddie tried to follow along, but his mind kept drifting back to his conversation with Brian that morning. There was something about the way Brian had spoken about Jeffrey, about regrets and unsaid things, that had stirred something in Freddie he hadn't expected. He thought about his own life, the opportunities he'd let slip away, the words he'd never said, the marriage that had ended not because of some grand tragedy, but simply because it had ended, because he and Margaret had stopped trying, stopped caring, and one day she'd walked out the door, and Freddie had realized he felt nothing except mild relief. What did that say about him? What kind of man felt relieved when his marriage ended? What kind of man reached 44 with nothing that truly mattered? Dylan called out to him, snapping him back to the present, asked if Freddie had understood the part about fermentation temperature. Freddie admitted he hadn't. He'd gotten distracted. Dylan smiled patiently and started explaining again. And Freddie, for the first time in a long time, really listened, really tried to learn. Because maybe Brian was right, maybe life wasn't about knowing all the answers. Maybe it was just about having the courage to stay and try. Later, as the sun began to set, Freddie stepped out of the shed and saw Summer standing in the middle of the vineyard, gazing toward the mountains in the distance. She hadn't noticed him approach, and for a moment, Freddie just watched the way she held the clipboard against her chest, how her shoulders were slightly tense, how she looked like someone carrying the weight of the entire world alone. And Freddie thought, for the first time, that maybe Summer Armstrong wasn't just a bossy American woman with an opinion about everything. Maybe she was someone who, just like him, was trying to figure out what the hell to do with her life. He cleared his throat. Summer turned, startled, and her expression immediately shut down. Freddie said, in carefully neutral tones, that Brian had asked him to tell her dinner was ready. She nodded, thanked him curtly, and walked past him toward the house. He stood there, watching the sunset, and he thought that maybe, just maybe, Summer Armstrong was the most complicated person he'd ever met, and the most interesting. Not romantically, of course, just interesting. He shook his head, annoyed at himself, and followed her back toward the house. 3 weeks had passed since Summer arrived in Mendoza, and the vineyard was finally starting to take shape. The vines had been properly pruned. The irrigation system was working, after she'd explained to Freddie for the 5th time that no, he couldn't just let nature take its course, and there was a solid plan in place for the next harvest. But something else was happening, something neither of them was willing to name or admit, not even to themselves. The forced coexistence had evolved into something that could, under generous circumstances, be called a functional partnership. They still argued daily. They still exchanged barbs with the regularity of a Swiss clock. But there was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference in the way those arguments unfolded now. They were no longer battles for dominance. They were something else. Something neither could define, but both could feel, like a constant current humming in the air between them. She had started to notice things about Freddie that she really shouldn't have been noticing. Small things, irrelevant things. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was frustrated. How his eyes narrowed slightly before delivering a particularly sharp remark. How he always made too much tea in the morning, as if subconsciously, expecting someone to share it with him. How he had an impressive memory and remembered every technical detail she mentioned, even when he pretended not to be listening. And there were moments, small, irritating moments, when she found herself waiting for his sarcastic replies, anticipating them, occasionally even enjoying them, which was absolutely ridiculous. Summer Armstrong did not enjoy sarcasm. She tolerated it when necessary, but she certainly didn't enjoy it, and she definitely should not have been. At 7 o'clock on a random Thursday morning, drinking coffee in the kitchen and feeling something dangerously close to disappointment because Freddie hadn't yet appeared to make one of his irritating comments about her robotic morning efficiency. She looked at the clock. 7:15. Freddie always appeared at 7:15 like a damn clock. Where on earth was he? The kitchen door opened, and Freddie walked in barefoot, wearing gray sweatpants and a wrinkled white t-shirt that had clearly been used for sleeping. His hair was messily tousled in a way Summer observed, with annoyance, was naturally attractive. He yawned, rubbed his face, and went straight to the kettle without saying a word. Summer took a sip of coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup. She asked with poisonous sweetness if he'd slept badly or if he was cultivating the confused castaway aesthetic on purpose. Still facing away from her, he replied that he had slept perfectly well and that his level of morning grooming was none of her concern. He added, while pouring water into the kettle, that some people didn't feel the need to look like they were heading to a job interview at 7 in the morning. Summer looked down at her own outfit. Dark jeans, a perfectly pressed white blouse, hair pulled back in a low bun, and replied that some people valued professionalism. He finally turned around, leaning against the counter while waiting for the hot water to boil, and said professionalism didn't require her to look as though she was constantly prepared to inspect troops. Summer raised an eyebrow and shot back that sloppiness wasn't the same as authenticity, though Freddie probably didn't know the difference. Freddie smiled. That slow, dangerous smile Summer had learned to recognize as the prelude to something particularly aggravating. He said it was funny how she always had an opinion about everything, from fermentation, temperature to what he wore to drink tea in his own kitchen. It must be exhausting, he added, carrying all that judgment around. She replied that it wasn't nearly as exhausting as dealing with someone whose main contribution to any conversation was defensive sarcasm. There was a moment of silence. The kettle whistled. Freddie made his tea with deliberately slow movements, as if carefully considering his next words. Then, without looking at her, he said maybe she was right. Maybe he did use sarcasm as a defense, but at least he was aware of it. Unlike certain people who used perfectionism and control to avoid anything that might look remotely like vulnerability. Summer felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was something more uncomfortable, something dangerously close to recognition. She set her cup down hard on the table and said she hadn't come to Mendoza to be psychoanalyzed by a failed literary critic who thought reading books qualified him as an expert on human nature. Freddie took a sip of tea, still leaning against the counter, and said she was right again. He wasn't an expert on human nature, but he knew enough to recognize someone who was running from something. And Summer Armstrong ran faster than anyone he had ever met. Summer opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out, because he was right, and they both knew it. She grabbed her clipboard, stood up with forced dignity, and said she had work to. Freddie nodded, watching her walk out the door. And when she was gone, he closed his eyes and pressed his fingers to his temples, wondering why on earth he had said that. Because the truth was, Freddie was running too. From loneliness, from failure, from the growing sense that he had wasted half his life pretending to know who he was. And the irony of accusing Summer of doing exactly the same thing wasn't lost on him. Later that day, Summer was in the small makeshift office she'd set up in a corner of the main house, answering emails and trying not to think about their morning conversation. Savannah had sent a string of messages asking how Mendoza was, whether she'd made any friends, whether she was having fun. Her mother replied with short, factual answers. Work was progressing well, the vineyard had potential, the weather was pleasant. She didn't mention Freddie, because what could she say? That she was spending her days arguing with an insufferable Englishman who had an infuriating ability to see right through her. That she couldn't decide whether she wanted to strangle him or what? There was no or. Definitely just strangling. She heard footsteps approaching, and Brian appeared in the doorway holding 2 bottles of cold water. He walked in casually, set one on her desk beside the laptop, and sat in the chair across from her, with the calm of a man who had infinite time and patience. He said he'd noticed that she and Freddie were making good progress with the work. Summer nodded, not looking up from the screen. Brian went on, saying he'd also noticed that the two of them spent a lot of time arguing. She replied, with forced patience, that disagreements were normal in professional environments. He smiled faintly, that knowing kind of smile that suggested he saw right through what she was trying to ignore, and said there was a difference between professional disagreements and the kind of exchanges that felt more like fencing duels. She finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. She asked, with polite coldness, exactly where he was going with this. Brian didn't seem the least bit intimidated. He said he'd worked with Jeffrey for 30 years, had seen all kinds of partnerships, all kinds of dynamics, and he knew when 2 people were fighting because they disagreed, and when they were fighting because they didn't want to admit something else. She and Freddie, in his opinion, were definitely the latter. Summer said, with complete seriousness, that he was reading into things that weren't there, that she and the Englishman were professionals working together under difficult circumstances. End of story. Brian tilted his head slightly, still wearing that subtle smile, and said maybe that was true, but she should ask herself why she was being so defensive about it. Then he stood up, said he was going to check the barrels, and left her alone with her thoughts. She sat in silence, staring at the bottle of water she hadn't asked for. She picked it up, took a sip, and admitted, only to herself and with deep reluctance, that maybe, just maybe, Freddie Brown wasn't only a professional problem to be managed. He was starting to become something more complicated, and she hated complicated things. Meanwhile, Freddie was in the vineyard with Dylan, learning about the grafting process. Dylan explained with his usual enthusiasm, but Freddie was distracted. His mind kept returning to their morning conversation, to the look on Summer's face when he said she was running from something. He'd seen something there, a flicker of something she usually kept hidden behind that armor of competence and control. And Freddie wondered, not for the first time, what lay behind that armor, who Summer was when she wasn't in consultant mode, when she wasn't trying to control everything and everyone around her, when she allowed someone to actually see her. Dylan called him back to attention, and Freddie realized he had completely lost track of the explanation. He apologized, saying he was tired. Dylan smiled, understanding, and said everyone was a bit tired, that working with vineyards was physically exhausting, but worth it. Then, with a subtlety that wasn't really subtle, Dylan mentioned he'd noticed that Freddie and Summer seemed to be getting along better. Freddie laughed, a short, humorless sound. He said that getting along better was a very generous description of what was happening. Dylan shrugged and replied that sometimes the best partnerships started with conflict, that 2 people who challenged each other often created something better than 2 people who agreed all the time. Freddie looked at Dylan, really looked, and asked if he was talking about wine or something else entirely. Dylan smiled, far too innocent to be believable, and said he was talking about wine. Obviously. Freddie shook his head but smiled. Later, as he was walking back toward the house, Freddie saw Summer sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset. She had a notebook in her lap and seemed to be writing something. He hesitated, considering whether he should just take the side door and avoid her for the rest of the evening. But something made him stop. Something he didn't want to examine too closely. He climbed the steps to the porch, making enough noise to announce his presence. Summer looked up, saw him, and immediately closed the notebook, as if she'd been caught doing something private. Freddie sat in the chair next to hers without asking permission, and they stayed silent for a few minutes. Then Freddie said, without looking at her, that he'd been thinking about what he'd said that morning, that maybe he'd been unfair. Summer didn't reply immediately. She just kept her eyes on the horizon. Then, in a softer voice than he expected, she said, maybe he was right, that maybe she did run, that it was easier to focus on work, on fixing other people's problems, than to deal with her own. Freddie looked at her, surprised by the admission. He said he understood, that he'd done the same thing for years, that literary criticism had been a convenient way to stay involved with stories without having to live one himself. Summer finally looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no sarcasm or defense in her gaze. Just understanding. She asked with genuine curiosity why he had stayed in Mendoza, why he hadn't sold the vineyard and gone back to London. Freddie thought for a long moment. He said he'd stayed because there was nothing waiting for him in London, and that maybe, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to build something, even if he didn't know how, even if he'd probably fail. Summer nodded, as if she understood perfectly. She said she admired that, the courage to try. He gave a short laugh and said he didn't feel courageous. He felt terrified most of the time. She smiled, a small, genuine smile, and said, maybe that's exactly what courage was, doing things even when you're terrified. There was another silence, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something different, something neither of them was ready to name. Then Summer stood up, said she was going to bed early, and walked away. Freddie stayed there watching the sky slowly darken, and thought that maybe Summer was the bravest person he had ever met, and the most frightening. The following week, Brian decided they needed to test the wines Jeffrey had left aging before he died. It was an important ritual, he explained, because it would define the direction the vineyard should take in the coming years. Summer agreed immediately, switching into professional mode. Freddie accepted with less enthusiasm, still traumatized from previous tasting sessions, where Summer had mercilessly mocked his pedestrianly undeveloped palate. They gathered in the fermentation shed on a cool evening, with Brian, Dylan, and a few carefully selected bottles from previous years. The idea was to taste, evaluate, and decide which wines had commercial potential and which should be discarded or blended. Summer was in her element. She swirled the glasses with professional precision, sniffed with intense concentration, tasted with almost religious seriousness, and took meticulous notes. Freddie, sitting beside her, tried to follow the same process, but was painfully aware that he had no idea what he was doing. When they reached the third bottle, a 5-year-old Cabernet Sauvignon, Summer tasted it, paused, and said it was promising. It had body, complexity, and a surprisingly long finish. Then she turned to Freddie and asked with a seriousness that indicated it wasn't a rhetorical question what he thought. Freddie tasted it, really focused this time, tried to identify what Summer was sensing, or rather, feeling, and said hesitantly that it was richer than the previous ones, that it had something that reminded him of. He hesitated, knowing he'd sound ridiculous. Dark fruit, maybe plums? Summer stared at him for a long moment. Then, to Freddie's absolute surprise, she smiled. Not a sarcastic or condescending smile, but a genuine one. She said he was right, that there were definitely notes of plum, along with dark chocolate and a touch of tobacco. Freddie blinked, startled by the compliment. Dylan clapped enthusiastically, saying Freddie was developing a palate. Brian just smiled, watching the exchange with an expression that clearly said, "I knew it." As the night went on and more bottles were opened, something shifted. The conversations began to flow more easily. Summer explained techniques without condescension. Freddie asked questions without defensiveness. Dylan told stories about famous wines with his poetic enthusiasm. Brian shared memories of Jeffrey with a soft nostalgia. And at some point, after they had tasted 7 different wines and the moon hung high in the sky, Summer looked at Freddie and said, almost absent-mindedly, that he was learning quickly, that maybe he had a natural talent, one buried beneath years of deliberate neglect of his own palate. Freddie, slightly dizzy from the wine and the strangely pleasant atmosphere of the evening, replied that maybe she was a better teacher than she liked to admit. When she managed to stop treating everyone like incompetent subordinates, it should have been an insult. But the way he said it, with that faintly crooked smile and quiet voice, it sounded almost like a compliment. And Summer, to her own astonishment, laughed. A genuine, spontaneous laugh that made Freddie stop and look at her with an expression he quickly hid. Dylan and Brian exchanged glances. Neither said a word, but both thought the same thing. Something was definitely changing. When the night came to an end and everyone began to head home, Summer walked to the Jeep with Dylan, who had offered her a ride back to the inn. Freddie remained on the porch, watching them go, and Brian appeared beside him, lighting a cigarette, a habit he kept hidden from everyone except on rare occasions. Brian said without preamble that Summer was a good woman, intelligent, competent, but carrying baggage she pretended not to have. Freddie agreed, not entirely sure why Brian was saying any of this. Brian went on, saying Freddie carried baggage too, that both of them were the kind of people who were afraid to admit they needed something beyond work and purpose. Freddie turned to him, puzzled, and asked where he was going with this. Brian took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and said he wasn't going anywhere. He was just observing, and that sometimes the best things in life were the ones we didn't plan for, the ones that arrived disguised as problems and turned out to be exactly what we needed. Freddie didn't respond. He just stood there staring down the dark road where Dylan's Jeep had disappeared, taking Summer away, and he thought, with a mix of irritation and something that could almost be mistaken for fear, that maybe Brian was right, and that was absolutely terrifying. Summer, sitting in the passenger seat, stared out the window as Dylan drove in silence. Her mind was filled with conflicting thoughts, all circling around the same person. When had Freddie Brown stopped being just a professional problem? When had she started anticipating their sharp exchanges, the moments of mutual understanding, the rare instance when they stopped fighting and simply talked? And more importantly, why did that scare her so much? Dylan dropped her off at the inn with a polite nod, and Summer went up to her room, tossed her bag onto the chair, and sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Eden had been right. Mendoza did have a funny way of making people confront exactly what they were trying to avoid, and Summer was avoiding admitting that Freddie, with all his defensive sarcasm and hidden vulnerability, was starting to mean something. She didn't know what. She wasn't ready to know, but something was changing, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, ignore it, or rationalize it, the truth was simple and terrifying. Freddie Brown was starting to matter, and Summer Armstrong had no idea what to do about it. 2 months had passed since Summer arrived in Mendoza, and the vineyard was unrecognizable. The vines had been carefully tended, the irrigation system was working perfectly, the new barrels had arrived, and there was even a drafted marketing plan, thanks to a particularly heated 3-hour argument between Summer and Freddie about branding that, surprisingly, ended with them agreeing on something. But if the vineyard was improving, the dynamic between Freddie and Summer was becoming progressively more complicated, not in obvious ways. There were no dramatic declarations or cinematic moments. It was subtler than that. It was in the way Freddie had started preparing tea for 2 every morning, leaving the second cup on the table as if it were coincidence. It was in how Summer had stopped leaving right after their work meetings and lingered for a few extra minutes, stretching out conversations that didn't need to be stretched. It was in the silences that were no longer uncomfortable but had become almost intimate, and they both hated it. Summer woke up that morning with an irritation she couldn't quite trace. She showered, dressed with her usual efficiency, and went downstairs to the inn's kitchen, where she found Eden making coffee with that mysterious smile that always put Summer on the defensive. Eden greeted her cheerfully and asked how work at the vineyard was going. Summer replied, perhaps more brusquely than necessary, that it was going. "Well, thank you." Eden tilted her head, studying her with those annoyingly perceptive eyes, and asked if Summer had slept well. She seemed tense. Summer said she'd slept perfectly fine and wasn't tense, just busy. Eden smiled in that knowing way that suggested she didn't believe a word, and said she'd noticed Summer had been spending a lot of time at the vineyard lately. More than necessary, perhaps. Almost as if she were avoiding coming back to the inn, or as if she were avoiding being alone with her own thoughts. Summer felt something tighten in her chest. She replied with polite coldness that she was doing her job and that Eden, with all due respect, should concern herself less with her guests' personal lives. Eden didn't seem offended. She simply kept smiling and said that Mendoza had that effect on people. It made them confront things they'd rather ignore, and Summer, clearly, was ignoring something big. Before Summer could answer, her phone rang. It was, Savannah, Summer answered with barely disguised relief, escaping Eden and the uncomfortable conversation. Savannah was full of energy, talking quickly about a new project at work, a new restaurant she'd discovered, and then casually, she asked if her mother had met anyone interesting in Mendoza. Summer, walking outside the inn for privacy, replied that no, she was there only to work. Savannah made a skeptical sound and said her mother was always there only to work, and maybe it was. Time to consider that life could be more than that. Summer felt a wave of irritation. She asked with forced patience why everyone suddenly had an opinion about her personal life. Savannah laughed and said it was because everyone could see something her mother refused to see, that she had spent the last 5 years using work as a shield, and maybe it was time to lower that shield. Summer replied, more harshly than she intended, that she didn't need life advice from someone who was 22 and changed jobs every 6 months. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Savannah said in a softer voice that she just wanted her mother to be happy, truly happy, not just productive. Summer closed her eyes, guilt washing over her immediately. She apologized, said she was stressed with work. Savannah accepted the apology, but before hanging up, she said something that echoed in Summer's head for the rest of the day. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't failing, it's succeeding at something that truly matters. Freddie was on the porch when Summer arrived at the vineyard, later than usual. He was reading, as always, but this time it wasn't fiction. It was a book about viticulture that Brian had lent him, and Freddie was genuinely trying to learn. When he heard Summer's car approaching, he lowered the book and watched her step out, noticing immediately that something was different. She looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, as if she were carrying something heavy she didn't want to share. Freddie stood and walked down the porch steps, meeting her halfway. He asked, with studied casualness, if everything was all right. Summer replied automatically that yes, of course. Why wouldn't it be? Freddie observed her for a moment, those gray eyes seeing more than she wanted them to, and said she was a terrible liar for someone who spent so much time insisting on honesty. Something cracked inside her, something small, but significant. She said, in a quieter voice than she meant to, that she'd argued with her daughter. Not exactly an argument, but she'd said something unkind, and now she felt guilty. Freddie nodded, as if he understood perfectly, and said guilt was a particularly inconvenient emotion, because it usually meant you cared. Summer looked at him, surprised by the remark. Freddie shrugged and said he'd learned that the hard way, that he'd spent years not feeling guilty about anything, because he hadn't cared enough, and that now that he was beginning to care again about the vineyard, the people here, his own life, guilt had come back with a vengeance. There was a moment of silence. Summer asked, almost without thinking, what he felt guilty about. Freddie hesitated, then said he felt guilty for wasting so much time, for living a life that looked safe on paper but had never really been his, for letting his marriage end without a fight because, honestly, he'd never cared enough to fight. Summer stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she said, with a surprising honesty, that she understood, that she too carried guilt. Guilt for becoming so focused on professional success that she'd forgotten to be anything else. A present mother, an available friend, a complete person. Freddie looked at her, really looked, and said she was more than she realized. That she was complicated, yes, and bossy, and had absurdly high standards, but that she was also brilliant, dedicated, and genuinely passionate about what she did, and that any daughter with Summer as a mother was lucky, even if they sometimes argued. Summer felt something strange in her chest, something warm and uncomfortable that she didn't want to examine. She thanked him abruptly and said she needed to get to work. Freddie nodded, watching her walk away, and thought that Summer was the most complicated and fascinating woman he'd ever met, and that it was becoming a bigger problem every day. 2 days later, something happened that changed everything. A potential buyer had appeared, a businessman from Buenos Aires, interested in investing in boutique vineyards. Brian had scheduled a meeting, and both Freddie and Summer would need to be present to present the vineyard's vision and discuss possibilities. Summer prepared with her usual efficiency. She dressed in a flawless professional outfit, crafted a detailed presentation with financial projections and market strategies, and arrived at the vineyard ready to impress. Freddie, on the other hand, was nervous in a way he couldn't hide. He had put on a dress shirt and had even combed his hair, but he was pacing the porch like a caged animal. Summer climbed the steps and asked, with a dryness that masked something close to concern, if he was all right. Freddie stopped, looked at her, and said, with brutal honesty, that he had no idea what he was doing, that he was a failed literary critic, pretending to be a vineyard owner, and that the buyer would figure that out in 5 minutes. Summer looked at him for a long moment. Then, to both their surprise, she stepped closer and straightened the collar of his shirt, which was crooked. It was a simple, almost maternal gesture, but the closeness made something strange happen. Freddie went completely still, acutely aware of every inch between them. Summer noticed it too, and quickly stepped back, clearing her throat. She said, in a voice that tried to sound firm but came out slightly unsteady, that Freddie wasn't pretending to be a vineyard owner. He was one, and that over the past 2 months, he had learned more about wine than most people did in years. That when he stopped being defensive and actually paid attention, he was intelligent, perceptive, and had surprisingly good instincts. Freddie stared at her, surprised by the unexpected compliment. He asked if she actually believed that, or was just trying to make him feel better. Summer rolled her eyes and said that if she wanted to make him feel better, she'd invent a more comforting lie. The truth was that he had potential. He just needed to stop sabotaging himself with insecurity disguised as sarcasm. Freddie smiled, that genuine, rare smile that made something strange flutter in Summer's stomach. He said she had a very particular way of giving pep talks. Summer replied that she wasn't giving a pep talk. She was simply stating facts. Freddie said she was impossible. Summer said so was he, and somehow neither of them sounded like they were complaining. The meeting with the buyer went surprisingly well. Summer presented the numbers with her usual competence. Freddie contributed with sharp observations about vision and branding, and together they managed to create a convincing picture of a vineyard with real potential. The buyer was impressed, asked a few pointed questions, and said he'd be in touch to discuss terms. After he left, Brian hugged them both, saying they had been perfect, that they worked together even better than he'd hoped. Dylan, who had been watching from a distance, smiled in that dreamy way of his and said it was almost as if they were made for each other. Professionally, of course, Summer and Freddie exchanged a look. Neither said anything, but both thought the same thing. Maybe Dylan wasn't only talking about professionally, and that was terrifying. That night, Brian suggested they celebrate. He opened one of the best bottles in the vineyard, gathered everyone on the porch, and they toasted to the future. The conversation flowed, light and easy, and for the first time in weeks, Freddie and Summer managed to share the same space without the usual tension. But there was another kind of tension now, a different one, a growing awareness of every glance, every word, every moment of silence that lingered half a second too long. At one point, Dylan mentioned he'd seen Eden in town, and that she'd commented on how Summer seemed more relaxed lately. Summer denied it vehemently, insisting she was exactly as professional as always. Dylan smiled and said that relaxed didn't mean less professional. It meant more human. Freddie, watching Summer over the rim of his wine glass, murmured that she probably considered humanity a weakness. Summer turned to him, ready with a sharp retort, but stopped when she saw his expression. It wasn't sarcastic or teasing. It was something else, something softer, something that made her heart beat faster in a completely inappropriate way. She quickly looked away and said she was leaving. It was getting late. Freddie didn't try to stop her. He just watched her go, acutely aware that Brian and Dylan were watching him watch her. Brian took another sip of wine and said, casually, that Summer was a good woman. Freddie agreed, still staring at the dark road. Brian went on, saying she was the kind of woman who deserved someone who wasn't afraid to really see her, all the parts of her, not just the controlled version she showed the world. Freddie finally looked at him and asked why he was saying that. Brian shrugged and said he wasn't saying anything, just observing, and that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as complications. Dylan, ever the hopeless romantic, added that in wine the best blends were always the most unexpected ones, that sometimes mixing grapes that seemed incompatible created something extraordinary. Freddie said they were clearly drunk and delusional, but as he walked back inside the house, he couldn't stop thinking about what Brian had said. Someone who wasn't afraid to see her, all of her, and he realized with a mix of fear and something dangerously close to hope that he wanted to be that person. Summer, lying awake in her room at the inn, couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what was happening to her. When she'd arrived in Mendoza, everything had been simple. A job, a difficult client, a clear strategy, entry, execution, exit. But now nothing was simple. Freddie Brown, who was supposed to be just another incompetent vineyard owner, had become someone who challenged her in ways she hadn't expected, someone who saw her in ways that scared her, someone she had, inexplicably, started looking for every morning, as if the day couldn't start right without a sharp exchange over absolutely nothing. She picked up her phone and opened her chat with Savannah. She typed a message, deleted it, thought for a moment. Finally, she wrote, "You were right, about me using work as a shield. I'm trying to change that." Savannah replied within seconds. "Mom, I'm so proud of you. What happened? Did you meet someone?" Summer looked at the message for a long moment. Then she typed, "No, I'm just trying to be more human." Savannah sent 3 heart emojis and wrote, "That's all I ever wanted for you." Summer smiled. Then she put her phone away and forced herself to sleep. But before she finally drifted off, she allowed herself to think, just for a moment, about the way Freddie had gone completely still when she'd straightened his shirt collar, the way he'd looked at her after the meeting, the way his presence had begun to mean something she couldn't quite name, and she admitted, only in the silence of her own mind, where no one else could. Here, she was in trouble, big trouble. The next morning, Summer arrived at the vineyard with renewed determination to keep things strictly professional. No personal conversations, no prolonged eye contact, no allowing that thing to grow. But the universe apparently had other plans. Brian announced that he had to go to Buenos Aires for 3 days to handle some legal matters related to the property, and that Dylan had come down with a bad case of the flu and wouldn't be able to work, which meant Freddie and Summer would be alone at the vineyard. The two exchanged glances, wearing identical expressions of barely disguised panic. Brian, completely oblivious to the tension, said they were competent adults and would surely manage 3 days on their own. After all, they worked well together, didn't they? Summer answered far too quickly that yes, of course, no problem. Freddie agreed, in a voice that tried to sound casual. Brian smiled, satisfied, and left, leaving the two of them standing in the middle of the vineyard, fully aware that the next 3 days were going to be interesting. Summer cleared her throat and said they should divide the tasks efficiently to minimize wasted time. Freddie agreed, also a little too quickly, and both tried to ignore the fact that they were avoiding looking directly at each other. But 3 days alone in a vineyard is a long time, and some feelings, no matter how hard you try to suppress them, have a most inconvenient way of rising to the surface, especially when there's no one else around to act as a buffer between you and the person you're desperately trying not to admit matters to you. The first day alone began with an almost comical determination to keep their distance. Summer arrived at the vineyard at 7 in the morning, as usual, but this time with a meticulously organized list of tasks designed to ensure that she and Freddie would work on opposite sides of the property for as long as possible. She would handle the northern vines, reviewing each row and making notes on their progress. He would stay in the shed, organizing the barrels and checking the fermentation equipment. Simple, efficient, safe. Freddie had reached the same conclusion. When Summer walked into the kitchen, he was already there, preparing tea with exaggerated focus, as if it were the most important task in the universe. He muttered a good morning without looking at her, and Summer responded in kind, pouring herself coffee and positioning herself on the opposite side of the table, as far away as possible. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the comfortable silence that had begun to develop between them in recent weeks. It was tense, charged, the kind of silence that shouted everything neither of them was willing to say. Freddie took a sip of tea and asked, without looking at her, if Summer had the task list. Summer said she did, sliding a piece of paper across the table toward him as if it were a bomb about to detonate. Freddie read it quickly, nodded and said it looked efficient. Summer said she always was. Freddie mumbled something that sounded like, "I know," but she pretended not to hear. Then Summer grabbed her clipboard, her water bottle, and headed for the door, relieved to escape the suffocating kitchen. Freddie stayed behind, staring at the empty teacup in front of him, the one he had automatically prepared for Summer, now sitting there unused like a silent accusation. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and wondered when exactly his life had become so absurdly complicated. By noon, their avoidance strategy was working perfectly. Summer had spent the entire morning among the vines, working with fierce concentration that left little room for inconvenient thoughts. Freddie had stayed in the shed, organizing barrels with a level of precision that would have impressed even Summer, if she had been there to see it. But then the heat became unbearable. The Mendoza sun was relentless that time of year, and Summer, who had refused to go back to the house for lunch just to avoid running into Freddie, was beginning to feel the effects of dehydration. She stopped, leaned against a nearby tree, and drank the last of her water, realizing too late that it wasn't enough. She was debating whether it was absolutely necessary to go back to the house, or if she could simply push through and deal with the thirst when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned and saw Freddie walking toward her, carrying a large thermos and 2 cups. He stopped a respectful distance away, raised the thermos, and said with studied casualness that he had made lemonade. Lots of lemonade, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste. Summer stared at him for a long moment, torn between gratitude and irritation that he had broken the carefully maintained distance. But she was thirsty, very thirsty. So she muttered a thank you and reached out to take the cup. Freddie poured the lemonade, handed it to her, and stood there, clearly unsure whether he should leave or stay. Summer took a sip. It was perfect, cold, with just the right amount of sugar and lemon. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring it, and when she opened them, Freddie was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He quickly looked away and asked how the work on the vines was going. Summer said it was going well, that she'd found a few areas that needed attention but nothing critical. Freddie nodded and said the shed was organized, that he'd cataloged all the barrels and completed a full inventory. Summer was impressed and said that was great, that she'd review it later. There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, just heavy, as if both were waiting for the other to say something more, though neither knew what that might be. Then Freddie sighed and said he'd better get back to the shed. Summer nodded and watched him leave, holding the cup of lemonade as if it were something precious. And she thought, with a mix of irritation and tenderness she didn't want to feel, that Freddie Brown had an infuriating way of being kind exactly when she was trying to keep her distance. By evening, their mutual avoidance had become unsustainable. Summer was in the kitchen preparing something quick for dinner, a salad and a sandwich, nothing fancy. When Freddie walked in, he stopped at the door, clearly surprised to find her there. Summer looked up, equally surprised, and for a moment they just stood there, staring at each other like 2 startled animals. Then Freddie said with ridiculous formality that he didn't want to interrupt, that he could eat later. Summer rolled her eyes and said it was his kitchen, and it would be absurd for him to go hungry just because they were 2 emotionally incompetent adults who couldn't be in the same room without acting like awkward teenagers. Freddie blinked. Then slowly he smiled, that genuine, rare smile that did strange things to Summer's heartbeat. He said she had a very eloquent way of calling things by their name. Summer replied that it was a gift. He said it was terrifying. She asked if he wanted dinner or not. He stepped into the kitchen. They prepared the meal in silence, but it was a different silence now, less tense, almost companionable. Freddie washed the lettuce while Summer sliced tomatoes. Summer made the dressing while Freddie toasted the bread. They moved around the kitchen with surprising ease, as if they had done it hundreds of times before. When they finally sat down to eat, Freddie poured wine, one of Jeffrey's oldest Malbecs, and they toasted in silence. Summer took a sip, closed her eyes to savor the taste, and said it was excellent. Freddie agreed. Then, with unusual hesitation, he asked if she thought they had a real chance of making it work. The vineyard, he clarified quickly. If she thought they had a chance to turn it into something successful. She looked at him, saw the genuine vulnerability in the question, the way he was truly asking for her opinion, not just teasing her. She set her glass down and said with a sincerity that surprised her that yes, she thought they had a very good chance, that the vineyard had real potential, and that Freddie, when he stopped sabotaging himself, was a surprisingly competent partner. Freddie smiled, but there was something else in his eyes, something that made Summer's heart race. He said she was too. Surprising, that when she stopped trying to control absolutely everything, she was, he paused, searching for the right word, extraordinary. Summer felt the air leave her lungs. No one had ever called her extraordinary. Competent, yes. Efficient, always. But extraordinary. She had no idea what to do with that. So she did what she always did when things got too emotional. She deflected. She said lightly that extraordinary was a big word coming from someone who had called her dictatorial 3 weeks ago. Freddie replied that the two things weren't mutually exclusive, that she could be dictatorial and extraordinary at the same time. In fact, he suspected one quality fueled the other. Summer had no answer for that. She just took another sip of wine and changed the subject, asking about the book he was reading. And Freddie, understanding the cue, let it go. But the tension remained, vibrating in the air between them like an over-tightened violin string. On the second day alone, something shifted. Maybe it was the fact that avoidance had proven impossible, or maybe it was because both of them were tired of fighting something that was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. But somehow, without discussing or planning it, they stopped trying to keep their distance. They worked together among the vines in the morning. Summer, explaining pruning techniques while Freddie asked intelligent questions and occasionally disagreed, thoughtfully. They had lunch together on the porch, sharing the food Summer had prepared and talking about trivial things, books, music, places they had been. And in the afternoon, when the heat became unbearable, Summer suggested they take a break. They sat beneath a large tree in the middle of the vineyard, drinking cold water and simply existing. No need to talk. No need to do anything. Freddie leaned back against the tree trunk, eyes closed, while Summer sat beside him, just a few inches away, gazing at the vines in the distance. She was aware of every breath he took, every small movement, and she realized, with startling clarity, that she had stopped thinking of him as a problem to be managed. He had become something entirely different, someone she sought out, someone whose opinion mattered, someone whose presence had begun to feel necessary in a way she couldn't rationalize. As if he could hear her thoughts, Freddie opened his eyes and turned his head toward her. He asked, with unusual gentleness, what she was thinking about. Summer considered lying, considered making a joke, but she was tired of running. So she told the truth. She said she was thinking about how everything had changed since she arrived, that she had come to Mendoza expecting a simple job and was discovering that nothing about it was simple, including him. Freddie was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he understood, that he had also come expecting one thing and had found something entirely different, something he didn't know how to name, but that was getting harder and harder to ignore. Summer's heart pounded. She asked, trying to sound casual but failing, what exactly he meant. Freddie met her eyes, and there was something there that made the world around them disappear. He said he was talking about her, about how she had walked into his life like a storm, messing everything up, challenging everything, and how somewhere between the arguments and the shared silences, he had realized he didn't want her to leave. Summer stopped breathing, literally stopped, because that was everything she had been afraid to hear, and everything she had secretly hoped he would say. But fear was stronger. The fear of being vulnerable, of admitting she felt the same, of risking something that seemed too big and too terrifying. So she did what she always did. She ran. She stood up quickly, said it was getting late, that she had work to do. Freddie didn't try to stop her. He just sat there, watching her go, and for the first time in weeks, he let the frustration and the pain show plainly on his face. Summer spent the rest of the day avoiding him again, but this time it was different. It wasn't strategic avoidance. It was pure panic, because Freddie had said out loud what she had been desperately trying not to admit. And now that the words existed in the air between them, there was no pretending they meant nothing. She worked until dark, then returned to the inn and found Eden waiting for her in the sitting room, as always, with tea and that all-seeing look in her eyes. Eden didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply watched as Summer walked in, dropped her bag on the chair, and collapsed onto the sofa with an expression of sheer despair. Then she asked, with her infuriating gentleness, if Summer wanted to talk about what was going on. Summer laughed, a humorless sound. She said there was nothing going on, that she was just tired. Eden tilted her head and replied that Summer was many things, but a convincing liar wasn't one of them. There was a long silence. Then, to her own surprise, Summer began to talk. She spoke about Freddie, about how he had entered her life as a professional problem and had become something she couldn't categorize. She spoke about the fear that, if she admitted what she was feeling, everything would change. And change, especially emotional change, was something she had carefully avoided for the past 5 years. Eden listened without interrupting. When Summer finally fell silent, exhausted, Eden said something simple yet profound. Running was easy. Anyone could run. But staying, allowing yourself to feel something real, risking vulnerability, that took real courage. And Eden thought Summer had that courage. She just needed to choose to use it. Summer felt tears threaten to rise but pushed them down. She said she didn't know if she was brave enough. Eden smiled and replied that no one ever did. Courage wasn't knowing you could do it. It was deciding to try, even when you didn't know. The next morning, Summer woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She was in love with Freddie Brown. She wasn't falling in love. She wasn't starting to like him. She was completely, irrevocably in love. And it terrified her in ways she hadn't even known were possible. But Eden had been right. She could choose to run, as she always had. Or she could stay. She arrived at the vineyard earlier than usual, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. She found Freddie on the porch as always, but he wasn't reading. He was just sitting there, staring at the horizon with an expression she couldn't decipher. When he heard her step onto the wooden stairs, he turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Summer said, with a voice steadier than she expected, that they needed to talk. Freddie nodded and replied that yes, they did. But before either of them could say another word, the sound of a car approaching broke the moment. Brian had returned from Buenos Aires, 1 day earlier than expected. He stepped out of the car with a broad smile, saying he had settled everything faster than he'd hoped, and that he had great news about the buyer in Buenos Aires. He was cheerful, speaking quickly, completely unaware of the electric tension between Freddie and Summer. Dylan arrived soon after, recovered from the flu and just as animated. The moment was gone. The conversation would have to wait. Summer and Freddie exchanged a glance over Brian and Dylan's shoulders, a silent promise that the conversation would still happen. But when, neither of them knew. That night they all had dinner together. Brian, Dylan, Summer, and Freddie. The conversation was light, full of plans for the vineyard and stories about Brian's trip. But Summer could barely focus. She was painfully aware of Freddie sitting across the table, of every glance he threw her way when he thought no one was looking. After dinner, Dylan suggested opening a special bottle to celebrate their progress. Brian agreed enthusiastically, and as the night unfolded, full of wine and laughter, Summer felt something tighten in her chest, because she knew she was running again, letting the moment pass. And if she didn't do something soon, she might never find the courage to do it at all. When the evening ended and everyone was getting ready to leave, Freddie caught up to her in the hallway. He gently took her arm, stopping her. He said quietly, just for her to hear, that they still needed to talk. Summer looked at him, at those gray eyes that had become so familiar, and nodded. She said yes, they did. Tomorrow. Freddie hesitated as if wanting, to say something more. Then he simply released her arm and said good night. Summer walked away, but when she reached her car, she looked back. Freddie was still standing on the porch, watching her, and she knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow would change everything. For better or for worse, she didn't know, but she couldn't run anymore. Summer didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in bed at the inn, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing 1,000 different versions of the conversation she would have with Freddie. In some, she was eloquent and confident, saying exactly what she felt with clarity and precision. In others, she stumbled over her words, vulnerable and exposed in ways that terrified her. And in all of them, there was the persistent fear that once she finally said aloud what she was feeling, everything would change irreversibly. But the truth was, everything had already changed. She had changed, and pretending otherwise was becoming impossible. At 5 in the morning, she gave up on sleep. She took a long shower, dressed with a care she tried to disguise as routine. Dark jeans, a white linen blouse, her hair down for the first time in weeks, and left the inn before Eden could appear with tea and unsolicited wisdom. The sun was just beginning to rise when she reached the vineyard. The property was wrapped in that soft, golden morning light that made everything look more beautiful, more full of possibility. Summer stopped the car and sat for a moment, her hands still on the wheel, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then she saw Freddie. He was sitting on the porch, as always, but he wasn't reading. He was simply there, looking out toward the horizon, holding a cup of tea that had probably gone cold. There was something in his posture, shoulders slightly slumped, head tilted, a stillness heavy with thought that made Summer's heart tighten. She got out of the car slowly, closed the door gently, and walked toward the porch. Every step felt immense, loaded with meaning. When she reached the bottom of the steps, Freddie finally looked at her. Their eyes met, and Summer saw everything there. The exhaustion of a sleepless night, the humanity he usually hid behind sarcasm, the fear, the hope. All of it laid bare in a way that broke something inside her and rebuilt it at the same time. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Freddie set the cup of tea aside, stood slowly, and walked down the steps until he was standing right in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he was breathing, fast, shallow, nervous. Freddie spoke first, his voice rough, thick with barely contained emotion. He said he had spent the entire night thinking about what to say when he saw her, that he had rehearsed elaborate speeches, tried to find the right words, but now that she was standing there in front of him, every word felt inadequate. Summer said, her own voice trembling despite her best efforts, that she had rehearsed too, that she had 1,000 things planned to say, but maybe, she admitted, the words didn't matter as much as she thought they did. Freddie took a step closer, so close that Summer could feel his warmth, the faint scent of tea and something essentially him that had become inexplicably comforting. He asked softly, gentler than she had ever heard him before, what did matter then? Summer looked at him, really looked, and allowed herself, for the first time since they met, to stop hiding, to stop controlling, to stop being afraid. She said with a raw honesty that left her completely exposed, that what mattered was that she had spent 2 months fighting something she finally realized was inevitable, that she had tried to label what she felt for him as irritation, or reluctant respect, or any other safe, manageable thing. But it wasn't any of those. It was love. She was in love with him completely, irrevocably, in a way that scared her more than anything ever had, because love meant being vulnerable. It meant risk. It meant admitting she needed someone. And Summer Armstrong had spent 5 years building a life where she needed no one. But here she was, needing him, wanting him, and finally, brave enough to admit it. There was a moment of absolute silence. Freddie looked at her with an expression Summer couldn't read. Then, slowly, he lifted a hand and touched her face, just a light touch, his fingers grazing her jawline with a tenderness that made her heart stop. He said, his voice rough with emotion, that he had spent 44 years living half a life, making safe choices, avoiding anything that might force him to feel deeply. And then she had come into his life like a storm, challenging him, provoking him, forcing him to actually live for the first time in decades. And somewhere between the arguments about tannins and the quiet sunsets they shared, he had fallen in love. so completely that he couldn't imagine his life without her, without the debates, without the sharp wit, without the way she saw him, really saw him. Beneath all the sarcasm and defenses, he was in love with her, and if she was willing to take the risk, so was he. Summer felt the tears finally spill over, sliding down her cheeks. Freddie brushed them away with his thumb, still holding her face with a tenderness that stood in complete contrast to everything they had been to each other until that moment. Then he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, if he could kiss her. Summer didn't trust her voice to answer. She simply nodded, her eyes closing in anticipation. Freddie leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to step back, to run, as she always did. But Summer didn't run. She stayed exactly where she was, waiting, barely breathing. And then his lips touched hers. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if both were testing whether this was real, whether the other was truly there. But then something shifted. The hesitation turned into certainty. The gentleness deepened into something more urgent, more necessary. Summer lifted her hands, clutching Freddie's shirt, pulling him closer. Freddie wrapped his arms around her, one hand at the small of her back, the other tangled in her hair, and the kiss intensified. 2 months of unresolved tension, of unsaid words, of denied feelings, all pouring into a single moment of absolute surrender. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, leaning against each other, foreheads touching, eyes still closed, as if opening them might break the spell. Freddie murmured, his voice rough, that he had waited 2 months for this. Summer laughed, a trembling, relieved sound, and said she had too, that she had fought it with every fiber of her being and was exhausted from fighting. Freddie kissed her forehead, then her temple, then her cheek, soft, lingering kisses that felt like promises. He told her she didn't have to fight anymore, that neither of them did. Summer nodded, still clutching his shirt like it was the only solid thing in a world turned upside down. And then, because they were who they were, Summer leaned back slightly and said, with a trembling smile, that this was going to completely complicate their working dynamic. Freddie laughed, a genuine, light, joyful laugh, and replied that their working dynamic had been complicated from the start. At least now, they had a good reason for it. Summer pulled him back into another kiss, and this time there was no hesitation, only surrender, only release. Only 2 adults finally brave enough to admit they wanted something more than safety and control. They wanted this. They wanted each other, and they were willing to risk everything for it. When they finally walked into the house, hand in hand, they found Brian in the kitchen making coffee. He looked at them, their intertwined hands, the expressions on their faces, and simply smiled. He said, with barely concealed satisfaction, that it was about time. Dylan, who had just arrived, took one look, shouted, "Finally!" and hugged them both at once, nearly spilling Brian's coffee in the process. Summer laughed, embarrassed but happier than she had felt in years. Freddie just shook his head, but he was smiling. That rare, genuine smile Summer had learned to treasure. Brian poured coffee for everyone and toasted with his mug to the vineyard's future and, with a knowing glance, to other futures as well. Dylan, ever the romantic, started talking about how some wines needed time to mature, how the best blends were always the unexpected ones, and how he had always known that Summer and Freddie were like 2 complementary grapes, destined to create something extraordinary together. Summer rolled her eyes, but was smiling. Freddie said Dylan was clearly drunk on romance, but he squeezed Summer's hand beneath the table, and for the first time since arriving in Mendoza, Summer allowed herself to simply be. No plans, no control, no fear. Just there, with Freddie by her side and a future that finally felt full of possibilities instead of obligations. The days that followed were a revelation, not because everything had changed drastically, but because everything had finally fallen into place. Summer and Freddie still argued about winemaking techniques, about marketing strategies, about absolutely everything. But now the arguments ended with stolen kisses in the fermentation room, with shared laughter on the porch at sunset, with an intimacy that made every moment richer. Summer called Savannah and told her, with a mix of nerves and joy, that she had met someone. Savannah screamed so loudly that Summer had to hold the phone away from her ear, then demanded every detail. Summer told her about Freddie, the insufferable, sarcastic Englishman, who had walked into her life as a professional problem and had become the best thing that had happened to her in years. Savannah said she wanted to meet him, that she was going to visit Mendoza soon, and that she was incredibly proud of her mother for finally allowing herself to be happy. 2 weeks later, the buyer from Buenos Aires closed the deal, a major investment that secured the vineyard's future. Brian was ecstatic, and Summer and Freddie were planning the next harvest with an excitement that surprised them both. But more important than the professional success was what was happening between them. Summer had officially moved into the house at the vineyard. Her toothbrush sat beside Freddie's in the bathroom. Her clothes hung mixed with his in the closet. They made coffee together every morning, worked side by side during the day, and spent the evenings on the porch, drinking wine and talking. And for the first time in her life, Summer felt no need to control every detail, no fear of being human, because Freddie saw her, all of her, and loved her exactly as she was. One night, lying in bed after an especially long day, Freddie turned to her and said, with a seriousness he rarely showed, that he had never imagined his life could be like this, that he had spent so much time merely existing. He had forgotten what it was like to truly live. Summer intertwined her fingers with his and said she understood, that she had forgotten too, but they were remembering together now. Freddie pulled her closer, kissed the top of her head, and murmured that he loved her. Summer, who rarely said those words easily, answered without hesitation. She said she loved him too, and that for the first time in 5 years, she was truly, completely happy. 3 months later, on a clear spring morning, Freddie woke before Summer and just lay there, watching her sleep, watching how the morning sun lit her blonde hair, the peaceful expression on her face, the way she had curled into him during the night, as if even in sleep she needed to be close. He thought about how much his life had changed, how he had come to Mendoza expecting to fail, to confirm all his worst suspicions about himself, and instead, he had found purpose and love. He had found Summer, and he realized, with absolute clarity, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, waking beside her, arguing over nonsense, building something real and lasting, together. Summer began to stir, blinking slowly, a sleepy smile appearing when she saw Freddie watching her. She murmured a hoarse good morning and stretched like a cat. Freddie smiled and said good morning back. Then, because he was Freddie and never did anything the conventional way, he said casually, as if commenting on the weather, that he thought they should get married. Summer froze, blinked, asked if she had heard him correctly. Freddie, suddenly nervous but trying to hide it, clarified. Yes, he had said married, that he knew it was fast, that it was completely irrational, but he was 44 and had wasted enough time, and that when you know, you know. And he knew. Summer was silent for so long that Freddie started to panic, but then she began to smile, that genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. She said yes, of course yes, because she knew too, and then she pulled him into a kiss that promised everything, every future, every joy, every life they would build together. They were married 2 months later, in a small and intimate ceremony at the vineyard. Savannah was Summer's maid of honor. Brian was Freddie's best man. Dylan officiated the ceremony with his signature romantic flair, and Eden provided flowers from the inn. There was nothing elaborate, nothing performative, just 2 people who had fought against love long enough and were finally ready to embrace it fully. When Freddie kissed the bride, Summer, who had never imagined she would marry again, felt something click into place, as if everything in her life had been a journey leading to that exact moment. And when she looked at Freddie, she saw the same realization reflected in his eyes. They had come to Mendoza searching for different things. He was looking for a new beginning. She was looking for another job. But they had found something neither of them expected. They had found each other, and they had found a home. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the vineyard's main house, lighting the kitchen where Freddie was making tea with his usual solemnity. It had been a year since the wedding, and their mornings had changed drastically. Instead of the contemplative silence that once accompanied his routine, there was now the unmistakable sound of a baby waking up in the next room. Victor Armstrong Brown, 3 months old, had impressively powerful lungs for someone so small. Freddie set the kettle aside and went to the nursery, finding Summer already standing by the crib, lifting their son with the kind of effortless efficiency he still envied. She was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt, his, obviously, her hair tied in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes that had become a permanent fixture these past months, and still somehow more beautiful than he thought humanly possible. Summer turned, saw Freddie standing in the doorway watching them, and gave him a tired smile. She asked if he planned to stand there like a useless statue or actually help. Freddie stepped in, reaching out with the cautious hands of someone still not entirely convinced he wouldn't break the tiny creature, and took Victor. The baby immediately nestled against his chest, and Freddie felt that familiar rush of terror and absolute love that had become constant since their son's birth. They returned to the kitchen together. Summer, pouring coffee while Freddie gently rocked Victor, murmuring nonsense words the baby seemed to find comforting. They sat at the table and Summer took a long sip of coffee before saying, with her usual blunt honesty, that she was exhausted in ways she hadn't known were possible. Freddie agreed completely. He said no one had warned him that babies were basically tiny dictators who ruled through sleep deprivation and psychological warfare. Summer laughed. That genuine laugh he had, learned to provoke and cherish, and reminded him that she had in fact warned him, multiple times. But he, in his characteristic arrogance, had said, "How hard could a baby be?" Freddie admitted he had been extremely, painfully naive. Victor chose that exact moment to start fussing, proving her point. The vineyard had thrived over the past year. The vines Summer had tended so meticulously were producing grapes of exceptional quality. The barrels they had purchased were now filled with perfectly aging wine. The Brown and Armstrong label, after a memorable 2-hour argument about whose name would come first, was beginning to appear on lists of Argentina's most promising wines. Brian was overjoyed with the progress, but none of that mattered as much as this moment. Sitting in the kitchen, exhausted and happy, with their son between them and a whole life ahead. Later that morning, Savannah arrived for her monthly visit. Over the last few months, since moving to Buenos Aires, to work at a startup, she had come religiously to see her mother, the stepfather she adored, and especially the baby brother she had declared to be the most perfect human ever created. She entered like a whirlwind of energy, shouting that she had arrived and demanding to know where her brother was. Summer pointed to the portable crib in the living room where Victor was napping, and Savannah immediately rushed over, making those high-pitched sounds adults inevitably make around babies. Freddie, who was in the kitchen finishing the dishes, something he had learned to do over the past year, to everyone's shock, called Savannah in to talk. She came in, hugged him tightly, and said he looked tired. Freddie replied that tired was a generous understatement. Functioning zombie was more accurate. Savannah laughed and told him he was doing wonderfully, that her mother had even admitted, during one of her rare moments of softness, that he was a better father than she had expected. Freddie raised an eyebrow and asked if that was supposed to be a compliment. Savannah said that coming from her mother, it was practically a declaration of eternal love. Freddie smiled and said he had learned to translate Summer, that when she said "you're doing reasonably well," what she really meant was "I'm proud of you," and when she said "this isn't completely terrible," it meant "I love it." Savannah nodded and added that Freddie had been good for her mother, that Summer had spent so much time being strong on her own she had forgotten what it was like to let someone be strong with her. Freddie was quiet for a moment, then said almost shyly that Summer had done the same for him, that he had spent too long living half a life, and she had forced him to truly live, to feel, to take risks. That afternoon, Brian and Dylan stopped by, as they often did, bringing wine and food. Dylan, recently engaged to a French graphic designer who had visited the vineyard and never left, was insufferably romantic about everything. He held Victor with reverence and declared that babies were miracles, tiny manifestations of pure love. Brian rolled his eyes and said babies were also tiny diaper-producing machines. But yes, they were kind of miraculous. He looked at Freddie and Summer sitting together on the couch and said he was proud of what they had built. Not just the vineyard, though that was impressive, but the family, the life, the courage to choose happiness over safety. When the sun began to set and everyone had gone, Freddie and Summer sat together on the porch. Victor slept in the crib beside them, making those small baby noises that were inexplicably comforting. Summer rested against Freddie's shoulder, utterly exhausted but utterly happy. Freddie thought about how, a year ago, he had arrived there lost, broken, with no idea who he was or what he wanted, and now he had everything, not because he had planned it, but because he had the courage to stay, to try, to open his heart. Summer murmured that she had never imagined her life could be like this, that she had spent so much time building her career, striving for success, proving she didn't need anyone, that she had forgotten to consider that maybe she wanted someone. But she did. She wanted Freddie. She wanted Victor. She wanted this imperfect, wonderful life. Freddie kissed the top of her head and said he understood, because he had forgotten what it meant to truly live, too. But she had reminded him. 3 more years passed, and Brown and Armstrong had just won its first international award. Their limited edition Malbec had been ranked among the top 10 in Argentina, and Summer was radiant, holding the trophy and taking photos with Freddie to send to Savannah. Victor, now 3.5, ran between the vines with the chaotic energy of a small child, chasing butterflies and asking why about absolutely everything. He had the impressive vocabulary of a child raised among adults who discussed everything, and the combined stubbornness of both parents. Freddie scooped Victor up when the boy tripped, lifting him high into the air and making him laugh, that loud, unrestrained laugh only children have. Summer watched the two of them, so alike and yet so different, and felt that familiar rush of deep, quiet happiness. As the sun set over Mendoza, everyone gathered on the porch to toast. Brian raised his glass and said that years ago he had bet that this vineyard had potential, but he hadn't just bet on the wine. He had bet on the people, on Freddie, who had arrived lost and found purpose, on Summer, who had learned how to tear down walls, and in both of them together, who had proven that the best things in life were always the unexpected ones. Everyone raised their glasses, and Victor shouted, "Cheers!" the way he had seen the adults do, making everyone burst into laughter. Freddie looked at Summer, who was holding her glass and smiling with that light in her eyes. He leaned in and whispered that he loved her. Summer answered without hesitation that she loved him too. And in that moment, with their family gathered, the vineyard thriving, and the future shining bright, Freddie realized he had finally found his story, and it was better than anything he could have ever written. He had come to Mendoza searching for a new beginning, but he had found an entirely new start. Not a second chance, but a first chance at something real, something lasting. Summer looked at him, caught him watching her, and smiled. That smile that was his alone, the one that meant home. And Freddie smiled back, because finally, after 48 years, he was exactly where he was meant to be, with the woman he loved, with the son he had never imagined having, in a place that had become more than just a property. It had become home, and there was absolutely nothing he would change. Wow, so what did you think of that turbulent trip to Mendoza? That clash between Freddie's British sarcasm and Summer's pragmatism is the heart of this mature love story. It proves that starting over after 40 is totally possible, and that your enemy might just be your destiny. I want to know, what was the exact moment when Freddie finally won you over? Was it when he saw Summer's passion, or during that final confession? Tell me in the comments, because your opinion is what drives this channel. If you made it this far, it's a sign. Subscribe now, leave your like so I know you loved it, and use the hype feature to help us reach more people who love a good, mature romance. I'll see you in the next story.